Welcome back to History's Secret Wars, the channel where we uncover the invisible conflicts that shape the destiny of nations. In our previous saga, we witnessed how the vampire bankers of Galata and the European powers enslaved the Ottoman Empire using debt as a weapon. They turned a superpower into a colony without ever firing a shot. But every story of slavery eventually demands a story of rebellion. Today, we begin a new 10-part epic. We are going to tell you the story of how those chains were finally broken. It is a story of 100 years of slavery, not of individuals, but of an entire nation. And it is the story of one man, a blonde-haired wolf from Salonica, who dared to look the world's greatest empires in the eye and say, no. The date is November 13th, 1918. The Great War is over. The Ottoman Empire has surrendered. Imagine standing on the shores of the Bosphorus on that gray, misty morning. The water, usually a sparkling blue, is churning with black steel. 61 massive Allied warships, British, French, Italian, and Greek, are anchoring right in front of the Sultan's palace. The guns of the British dreadnoughts are pointed directly at the heart of Istanbul. For the first time since 1453, Istanbul is occupied. To the world, this looked like a military occupation. But to the people of the empire, it was something far worse. It was the foreclosure. The creditors had arrived to seize the house. For 100 years, the empire had been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The Capitulations, legal and economic privileges granted to foreigners, had made it impossible for a Turk to compete in his own country. A French merchant paid no taxes. A Turkish merchant paid double. If a Briton committed a crime in Istanbul, he could not be tried by Ottoman courts. The public debt administration controlled the fields, the mines, and the ports. The empire was a sovereign state in name only. In reality, it was an open-air prison of debt. And now, the final sentence was being read. The Treaty of Sèvres, which the Allies were drafting in Paris, was not a peace treaty. It was a death warrant. The plan was to carve up the carcass. Italy would take the south, France would take the southeast. Greece would take the west, including the jewel of Smyrna. Britain would control the straits and the oil of Mosul. The Turks? They would be left with a small, barren patch of land in central Anatolia, a reservation where they could slowly die out, forever dependent on Western charity. The mood in Istanbul was one of absolute, crushing despair. The Sultan, Vahdettin, was terrified. He believed that the only way to save his throne and his life was to submit completely to the British. He was willing to sign anything, give up anything, just to be allowed to remain as a figurehead. The government was paralyzed. The intellectuals were debating which master would be kinder. Should we ask for an American mandate or a British protectorate? Slavery had become so normalized that freedom was no longer even a topic of discussion. The psychological chains were heavier than the iron ones. The people were exhausted. Years of war had left millions dead. Typhus and starvation were rampant. There were no guns. There was no ammunition. The treasury was not just empty. It was negative. But on that same dark day in November, as the enemy ships cast their long shadows over the city, a small boat was navigating through the steel giants. On board was a general named Mustafa Kemal. He looked at the imposing British fleet, the symbol of the world's undeniable power. His aide, weeping at the sight of the occupied capital, asked, "What will we do, Pasha?" Mustafa Kemal did not weep. He narrowed his blue eyes, cold as the winter sea, and spoke a sentence that would become the prophecy of the century: "They will go as they came." At that moment, it sounded like madness. How could one man, with no army, no money, and a death warrant on his head, force the greatest powers on earth to leave? The world saw a defeated general, but history was looking at the man who would forge the key to the chains. He realized that the fight was not just about borders. It was not just about driving out soldiers. It was about destroying the system, the 100-year-old economic slavery that allowed the West to own the East. He knew that true independence was not given, it was taken, and the price would be blood. Mustafa Kemal began to make his plans. He knew he could not fight from Istanbul, under the guns of the British. He needed to go into the heartland. He needed to go to Anatolia, to the forgotten peasants who had bled for the bankers' wars. He needed to ignite a fire that would burn the debt ledgers to ash. But how? The British intelligence was watching his every move. The Sultan was suspicious. The vampires were comfortable. To leave the city, he needed a cover story. He needed a miracle. And in a twist of irony, the British themselves would give him the ticket to start the rebellion that would destroy their empire's grip on the Middle East. In the next part, we will see the Great Escape. We will witness how Mustafa Kemal tricked the British High Command, secured the official seal of the Sultan, and boarded a rickety steamship to Samsun, carrying nothing but a broken compass and the burning will of a nation waiting to be born. The chains are locked tight, but the hammer is about to fall. The date is May 19th, 1919, a date etched in fire in the history of the Middle East. While the statesmen of Europe were drinking champagne in Versailles, carving up the map of the world, a rusty, dilapidated steamer named the Bandurma was struggling through the rough waves of the Black Sea. It carried Mustafa Kemal and a handful of loyal officers. They had no weapons to speak of. They had a chest of gold, but it was not enough to buy an army. What they carried was far more dangerous, an idea. They landed at Samsun, a gloomy port city on the Black Sea coast. The scene that greeted them was a nightmare. British officers controlled the port. Greek gangs roamed the countryside. The local Ottoman administration was broken, fearful, and compliant. The people were barefoot, starving, and ravaged by disease. This was the nation that Mustafa Kemal wanted to save. It looked less like a sleeping giant and more like a corpse. But Mustafa Kemal saw what the British did not. He saw the embers under the ash. He knew that the 100 years of economic slavery, the taxes, the debt, the foreign control, had created a deep, suppressed rage in the Anatolian people. They did not understand complex economics, but they understood that the wheat they grew was taken by foreigners while their children went hungry. They understood that their sons were sent to die in Yemen or Galicia for wars that profited only the vampires in Istanbul. Mustafa Kemal's mission, officially, was to restore order and disarm the remaining Ottoman militias to satisfy the British. He had been sent by the Sultan to act as an enforcer for the occupation. But the moment his boots touched the mud of Samsun, he tore up his orders. He began to send secret telegrams, not to the palace, but to the commanders of the scattered, broken army corps deep in the interior. "The capital is a prisoner," he wrote. "The nation's independence is in danger. Only the will of the nation can save the nation." This was treason, pure and simple. If the British caught him, he would be hanged. If the Sultan caught him, he would be executed. He moved inland, away from the coast, away from the range of the British naval guns. He traveled to Amasya, then Erzurum, then Sivas. The roads were virtually non-existent, another legacy of the dead administration, which only built railroads where they could extract resources, leaving the rest of the country in the medieval age. In every town, he met with the local notables, the religious leaders, and the remnants of the army. He told them the hard truth. Istanbul is dead. The Sultan is a captive. The foreigners plan to make us slaves in our own land. We have two choices, freedom or death. It was a hard sell. Many were tired. Many were afraid. Some argued that they should accept a British mandate, hoping that a civilized master would be better than chaos. Others looked to America for salvation. They were still thinking like slaves, looking for a kinder owner. Mustafa Kemal smashed this mentality. At the Congress of Sivas, when a medical student stood up and passionately argued against accepting an American mandate, declaring that they would rather die than be a protectorate, Mustafa Kemal famously replied, "Young man, even if we have nothing, even if they burn our homes, we will fight. There is no mandate, there is no protection, there is only independence." But rhetoric does not buy bullets. The practical reality was grim. The Ottoman army had been dissolved by the armistice. The weapons had been confiscated by the Allies. The treasury was in the hands of the British and French commissioners. How do you fight the world when you are bankrupt? This is where the secret war truly began. Mustafa Kemal and his inner circle had to build a shadow economy. They could not tax the people. The people had nothing left. They could not borrow from Europe. Europe was the enemy. They turned to smuggling. They established secret networks to steal weapons from the Allied depots in Istanbul and smuggle them across the Black Sea in small fishing boats. Women carried artillery shells on their backs through snow-covered mountains. It was a logistical miracle born of desperation. But the biggest threat was not the British army or the Greek forces landing in the west. The biggest threat was the Sultan himself. Realizing that his inspector general had gone rogue, the Sultan, under British pressure, issued a fatwa, religious decree, declaring Mustafa Kemal a traitor and an infidel. He sentenced him to death in absentia. He sent caliphate armies, Ottoman troops loyal to the throne, to crush the rebellion. Now, Mustafa Kemal was fighting a civil war and a war of independence simultaneously. Brother fought brother. The vampires in Istanbul poured money into the Sultan's forces, terrified that a nationalist victory would mean the end of their financial privileges. The darkness was closing in. The Greek army, funded and armed by Britain, began its march into the heart of Anatolia, burning villages as they came. They were aiming for Ankara, the dusty town Mustafa Kemal had made his headquarters. The chains were tightening. The one man stood alone on the Anatolian plateau, surrounded by enemies, branded a traitor, with an army of barefoot peasants. The world waited for the inevitable collapse, but they were about to learn a lesson in the economics of survival. In the next part, we will explore the invisible war, the desperate struggle to fund the rebellion. We will see how Mustafa Kemal implemented the national orders, a system of radical sacrifice that turned every home into a factory and every citizen into a soldier. The price of freedom was about to be paid in full. While Mustafa Kemal was sleeping in rough tents and eating dry bread in Anatolia, a very different kind of war was being fought in the salons of Istanbul. It was a war of words, of seduction, and of the most dangerous kind of slavery, the slavery of the mind. The Ottoman elite, the intellectuals, and the wealthy classes were terrified. They saw the British battleships. They saw the French troops. They looked at the poverty of their own people and concluded, "We cannot govern ourselves. We are too weak. We are too backward. We need a master." This was the mandate trap. It was a seductive idea pushed by the Western powers. They would not call it a colony. That was an ugly, old-fashioned word. They would call it a mandate, a benevolent guidance. "Let America or Britain run your economy, your courts, and your police," they said. "We will modernize you. We will bring you into the 20th century. All you have to do is sign over your sovereignty." For the vampire bankers of Galata, this was the dream scenario. A British or American mandate meant their loans were guaranteed. It meant the legal protections of the capitulations would be eternal. It meant stability for their investments. They used their newspapers and their influence to push this narrative. "Mustafa Kemal is a madman," they whispered. "He will drag us into ruin." The mandate is civilization. Even some of Mustafa Kemal's closest friends wavered. At the Sivas Congress, the debate raged for days. Why not accept an American mandate, they argued. America is rich. America is far away. They will not oppress us like the British. It sounded logical. It sounded safe. But Mustafa Kemal saw the hook inside the bait. He understood that a mandate was just a polite word for the 100 years of slavery continuing for another century. He knew that if you let a foreign power pay your bills, you let them write your laws. He stood before the Congress, his voice cutting through the smoke of hesitation. To accept a mandate is to admit that we are less than human. It is to admit that we are incapable of living as free men. A nation that begs for safety will never be safe. We will not be a colony. We will not be a protectorate. We will be fully independent, or we will cease to exist. This was the psychological turning point. He was not just fighting an army. He was fighting an inferiority complex that had been beaten into the Turkish people for generations. He had to convince a nation of farmers that they were equal to the lords of London. But declaring independence is easy. Surviving it is hard. By 1920, the British had occupied Istanbul officially. They dissolved the Ottoman Parliament. They arrested intellectuals and patriots and exiled them to Malta. The Sultan was now a complete puppet, signing death warrants for the nationalists as easily as he signed dinner menus. Mustafa Kemal responded by doing the unthinkable. He declared that the government in Istanbul was void. He established a new parliament, the Grand National Assembly, in the small, dusty town of Ankara. Ankara was not a city. It was a malaria-infested village with no electricity, no running water, and no hotels. The deputies slept in school dormitories. They used oil lamps. They ate bulgur soup. But for the first time in a century, the decisions made in this room were not dictated by a foreign ambassador or a Galata banker. However, the state in Ankara had a problem. It had zero money. The Ottoman gold was in Istanbul. The tax revenues were being collected by the Public Debt Administration. The customs duties were held by the Allies. How do you feed an army? How do you buy rifles? Mustafa Kemal turned to the only source of legitimacy left, the people. But he did not just ask for taxes. He asked for everything. He issued the Tekalif-i Milliye, national obligations, orders. This was not a tax law. It was a total mobilization of resources. Every household in Anatolia was ordered to provide a set of underwear, a pair of socks, and shoes for the army. Every merchant had to surrender 40% of their stock, food, cloth, nails, anything, to the state, to be paid back after the victory. All iron, all lead, all vehicles were requisitioned. It was a gamble of immense proportions. He was asking people who had nothing to give everything. If the people refused, the rebellion would collapse in a week. The British intelligence waited for the uprising against Kemal. They expected the peasants to turn on him. But the uprising never came. Instead, a miracle happened. Old women tore up their wool blankets to make socks for soldiers they would never meet. Blacksmiths worked through the night to turn scrap metal into bayonets. Farmers gave their last ox to pull cannons through the mud. Why? Because for the first time, they were not giving their wealth to a distant sultan or a foreign banker. They were giving it to themselves. They realized that this was not a war for a palace. It was a war for their own homes. The mandate trap had snapped shut, but it was empty. The bird had flown. The psychological chains were breaking. But the physical enemy was now at the door. The Greek army, fueled by British loans and armed with modern weaponry, began its general offensive. They were marching toward Ankara with one goal: to hang the bandit Mustafa Kemal and burn the rebellion to the ground. The one man had won the battle for the mind. Now, he had to win the battle for survival. While the peasants of Anatolia were giving their socks and shoes to the army, Mustafa Kemal knew that socks alone could not stop artillery. He needed heavy weapons. He needed ammunition. And for that, he needed a geopolitical miracle. The West was the enemy. The Sultan was the enemy. Who was left? He looked north, to the old enemy of the Ottoman Empire, Russia. But Russia had changed. The Tsar was dead. The Bolsheviks were in power. Lenin was fighting his own civil war against the Western-backed White Army. Mustafa Kemal realized that he and Lenin shared a common enemy: British imperialism. This was a dangerous game. Mustafa Kemal was not a communist. He was a nationalist. He hated the idea of replacing British chains with Russian ones. But he was a pragmatist. "We will dance with the devil until we cross the bridge," he reportedly said. He sent envoys to Moscow. The negotiations were tense. The Bolsheviks wanted Turkey to become a communist satellite. Kemal refused. He wanted an alliance of equals. In the end, mutual survival won out. The Treaty of Moscow was signed in 1921, and then the invisible war of logistics began. Russian gold and weapons began to flow across the Black Sea, but getting them to Ankara was a nightmare. The British Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world, blockaded the coast. They had battleships, destroyers, and searchlights sweeping the dark waters every night. Against this armada, the Turkish nationalists pitted fishing boats, small, wooden vessels called takas, manned by the Laz sailors of the Black Sea. These men were legendary smugglers. They knew every cove, every rock, every current. They would sail in the dead of night, their engines muffled, slipping right under the noses of the British destroyers. If they were caught, they were dead. But night after night, they unloaded crates of Mosin Nagant rifles, artillery shells, and gold bullion on the beaches of Inebolu. From the coast, there were no trains to the front. So, the Road of Independence was born. It was a human conveyor belt. Since the men were at the front, the logistics were handled by women. Thousands of women, with ox carts, carried the heavy shells through the Ilgaz Mountains. There is a famous story of a woman named Sheriff Baka. She was found frozen to death in the snow, draped over her ox cart. When they lifted her body, they found she had taken her own coat and blanket to cover the artillery shells, to keep the moisture from ruining the gunpowder. Her baby was frozen next to her. She had sacrificed her life and her child for a weapon she would never fire. This was the reality of the war the bankers in London did not understand. They calculated the war based on the number of rifles and the amount of credit. They did not have a column in their ledger for Sheriff Bachi. They did not understand that you cannot defeat a nation that values its freedom more than its children. While the supplies trickled in, the Greek army was advancing. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and backed by the infinite credit of the British Empire. By the summer of 1921, they had pushed deep into Anatolia. They were within hearing distance of Ankara. The sound of their cannons could be heard in the Grand National Assembly. Panic set in. Some deputies demanded that the capital be moved further east, to Kayseri. They said the war was lost. They said the army should retreat. Mustafa Kemal took the podium. He was exhausted. His ribs were broken from a fall from his horse, and he was running a high fever. But his will was unbroken. He issued an order that defied all military logic, an order that would change the history of warfare. There is no line of defense. There is a surface of defense. And that surface is the whole nation. Not 1 inch of the country is to be abandoned until it is drenched with the blood of its citizens. He was telling his commanders, "Do not retreat. If a unit is overrun, they fight where they stand. Every hill, every rock, every village is a fortress. We will make them pay for every meter in blood. The Battle of Sakarya was about to begin. It would be the longest pitched battle in history. 22 days and 22 nights of non-stop fighting. It was the clash of two worlds. The well-oiled machine of Western imperialism versus the desperate, ragged, unyielding will of a nation breaking its chains. The vampires in Galata held their breath. If Ankara fell, their debts would be secure. Their world would return to normal. But if the wolf won, their ledger books would burn. August 23, 1921. The banks of the Sakarya River. This was not just a battle, it was Armageddon for the Turkish nation. The Greek army, confident and superior in numbers, launched a massive assault to break the Turkish resistance once and for all. Their goal was Ankara. Their goal was the head of Mustafa Kemal. For 22 days, the battle raged. It was a grinder. Hills changed hands 10 times in a single day. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, bayonet against bayonet, rock against rock. The Turkish army was running out of everything. Officers were dying at a catastrophic rate. It became known as the Officers' War because so many commanders had to lead charges personally to keep the lines from breaking. Mustafa Kemal was at the front, commanding the battle from a forward observation post. He did not sleep. He smoked chain cigarettes and drank coffee, staring at the maps with an intensity that frightened his staff. He knew this was the all-in moment. If the line broke here, 100 years of struggle would end in total slavery. The British liaison officers with the Greek army were sending telegrams to London. The Turks are finished. They are collapsing. The Galata bankers were preparing to celebrate. The Ottoman debt bonds actually rose in value on the London Stock Exchange during the first week of the battle. The financial world was betting on the death of Turkey, but they did not factor in the surface of defense. Every time the Greek army broke through a line, they found another one. And another one. The Turkish soldiers, starving and ragged, simply refused to run. They fought with a ferocity that terrified the invaders. They were fighting for their homes, for their honor, for the memory of the humiliation they had suffered for a century. By the 21st day, the momentum shifted. The Greek army, overextended and exhausted by the relentless resistance, began to falter. They had advanced hundreds of kilometers from their supply bases. They were bleeding out. Mustafa Kemal sensed the moment. It is the instinct of a great predator. He saw the enemy waver. He ordered a counterattack. It was not a massive, sweeping maneuver. He did not have the resources for that. It was a push of pure will. The Turkish army, which was supposed to be dead, rose up and struck back. The Greek lines cracked. Then they broke. The retreat began. The Battle of Sakarya was the turning point. It was the moment the tide of history reversed. For 200 years, since the siege of Vienna in 1683, the Turks had been retreating from Europe. They had been losing territory, losing wars, losing dignity. At Sakarya, the retreat stopped. The sick man had died, yes, but a warrior had risen from his grave. The news shocked the world. In London, Prime Minister Lloyd George was stunned. In Paris, the government realized they had bet on the wrong horse. In Galata, the bankers went pale. They realized that the bandit in Ankara was not going to be hanged. He was going to win. But the war was not over. The Greek army had retreated, but they still occupied the rich western coast, including Smyrna, Izmir. They dug in, creating a massive line of fortifications that British engineers declared impregnable. They said it would take 6 months to break through, if it could be done at all. Mustafa Kemal waited. He spent a year preparing for the final blow. He played a game of deception. He pretended to seek peace. He organized horse races in Ankara to make the spies think he was relaxing. He lulled the enemy into complacency. Then, on August 26, 1922, he unleashed the Great Offensive. And Welbing, an offensive $7 of laws and competence. The impregnable British lines were shattered in 24 hours. The Turkish cavalry rode through the gaps. The Greek army collapsed into a chaotic rout. It was a race to the sea. The Turkish army marched 400 kilometers in 10 days. They moved so fast that the infantry outran their supply trucks. They lived on bread and sheer adrenaline. On September 9, 1922, the Turkish cavalry entered Izmir. The occupation was over. The symbol of the Levantines, the city of the merchants and the bankers, had fallen back into Turkish hands. But as the Turkish troops entered the city, a fire broke out. The Great Fire of Smyrna. It destroyed the European quarters, the banks, the warehouses of the foreign companies, It was a tragedy of immense proportions, but symbolically, it was the funeral pyre of the old order. The city of the vampires, the hub of the debt economy, was burning. The military war was won. The physical chains were broken. But Mustafa Kemal knew the hardest battle was yet to come. The soldiers had done their job. Now, it was time for the diplomats. The secret war was moving from the battlefield to a conference table in Switzerland, and the enemy there, Lord Curzon and the masters of finance, were far more dangerous than any general. The guns fell silent in October 1922. The Treaty of Mudanya ended the fighting. But the real war, the war for the soul and sovereignty of the new nation, began on November 20th, 1922, at the Beau Rivage Palace Hotel in Lausanne, Switzerland. This was the peace conference to end all peace conferences. On one side sat the big powers, the British Empire, represented by the arrogant and brilliant Lord Curzon, France, Italy, and the shadow representatives of the global financial system. On the other side sat a small, slightly deaf man with a hearing aid, Ismet Inonu, Mustafa Kemal's right-hand man. The atmosphere was icy. Lord Curzon treated the Turks not as victors, but as naughty children who needed to be disciplined. The Allies assumed Lausanne would be simple. The Turks would sign a treaty confirming their independence. Yes, but the system, the capitulations, the debts, the foreign courts would remain. After all, civilization demanded it. They laid their demands on the table. They wanted the Ottoman Public Debt Administration to continue. They wanted foreign judges in Turkish courts. They wanted control over Turkish tariffs. In short, they wanted the 100 years of slavery to continue under a new flag. Ismet Inonu, under strict orders from Mustafa Kemal, did something the Europeans had never seen a Middle Eastern diplomat do. He said no. And he did not just say no. He turned off his hearing aid. When Lord Curzon launched into long, eloquent speeches about international law and the sanctity of debt, lecturing Inonu on why Turkey must accept foreign oversight, Inonu would simply sit there, stone-faced. When Curzon finished, Inonu would turn his hearing aid back on and say, "I beg your pardon, Lord Curzon. I could not hear you. But our position remains. Total sovereignty. No capitulations. No foreign control." It drove Curzon insane. He was used to dictating terms to sultans and maharajas. He was not used to this stubborn refusal. The sticking point was the capitulations and the debt. The Europeans argued that without these protections, foreign businesses could not operate. They argued that the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was necessary to ensure the debt was paid. Inonu argued that the capitulations were the very chains that had kept Turkey backward. "We are a free nation," he declared. "We will pay our share of the debt, but we will pay it as a sovereign state, not as a colony. We will collect our own taxes. We will judge our own criminals. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration must go." The conference dragged on for months. It broke down completely in February 1923. Lord Curzon threatened Inonu. "You are refusing everything. I am putting everything you reject in my pocket. When you are bankrupt, when your ruined country needs money to rebuild, you will come to me on your knees. And then I will take everything out of my pocket, and you will pay double." It was a chilling threat. Curzon knew Turkey was devastated. The country was a ruin of burnt villages and unplanted fields. They had no capital. He was banking on economic reality crushing their political will. Ismet Inonu packed his bags and went back to Ankara. The war threatened to start again. The British fleet in Istanbul went to battle stations, but Mustafa Kemal did not blink. He knew the British public was tired of war. He knew the French were worried about Germany. He held his ground. "We prefer poverty to slavery," was the message from Ankara. Finally, the Allies blinked. They returned to the table. In July 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed. It was a diplomatic miracle. The capitulations were abolished, totally and completely. The Public Debt Administration was stripped of its power to collect taxes. It was reduced to a simple office in Paris with no authority over the Turkish peasant. The foreign courts were closed. Turkey had achieved what no other defeated nation of World War I had achieved. It tore up the victor's treaty and wrote its own. It broke the legal chains of 100 years. But Lord Curzon's threat hung in the air. The debt remained. The vampires had been kicked out of the tax office, but they still held the promissory notes. Turkey had agreed to pay a share of the Ottoman debt. And the country was, as Curzon predicted, in ruins. Now, the one man had to build a nation from ash. He had to prove that a country could modernize without becoming a slave to foreign capital. He had to invent a new economic model. In the next part, We will see the economic war. How did Ataturk build factories, railroads, and schools without borrowing a single penny from the West? How did he navigate the Great Depression? And how did the ghost of the Ottoman debt continue to haunt the new republic? The treaties were signed. The soldiers had gone home. The vampires had been evicted from the tax office. But in 1923, the Republic of Turkey was a land of orphans, widows, and rubble. The statistics were terrifying. There was almost no industry. A few factories in Istanbul and Izmir had been destroyed or abandoned by the fleeing Levantines. There were no Turkish engineers, no Turkish technicians, no Turkish capital class. The Muslim population had been farmers and soldiers for centuries, while trade and finance were the monopoly of the minorities who were now gone. And hanging over this devastation was the shadow of the debt. Turkey had agreed to pay 65% of the Ottoman Empire's debts. It was a crushing burden for a new state. Lord Curzon's threat echoed in Ankara. You will come back to me on your knees. Mustafa Kemal, now Ataturk, knew that political independence without economic independence was a lie. He famously said, "Victories on the battlefield are only permanent if they are crowned by victories in the economy." He refused to borrow. He knew that taking a loan from London or Paris in the 1920s would mean putting the chains back on. So he devised a new strategy: statism, devlet cilik. If there was no private capital to build factories, the state would do it. If there were no banks to lend to farmers, the state would create them. It was an economic mobilization as intense as the war itself. They nationalized the French-owned railways. They bought back the foreign-owned ports and mines. And they did it by paying with walnuts, figs, and tobacco. They bartered their way to ownership. The İş Bankası, business bank, was founded not by foreign investors, but by the money donated by Muslim communities in India to help the War of Independence. This capital, intended for bullets, was used to build the engine of the economy. Sugar factories rose in the steppes of Anatolia. Textile mills opened in Kayseri. The iron nets, railroads, began to weave the country together, built this time by Turkish engineers, not Germans looking for a kilometric guarantee. Then, in 1929, the world crashed. The Great Depression destroyed the economies of the West. The vampire bankers in New York and London were jumping out of windows. But strangely, Turkey kept growing. Because it was not integrated into the toxic global financial system, it was shielded from the worst of the crash. In fact, Ataturk used the depression to his advantage. He instituted a policy of clearing and trade. "You want to sell us trucks?" he told the West. "Fine, but we will not pay you in gold. We will pay you in oranges and cotton. Take it or leave it." Desperate for markets, the Western companies took it. But the Ottoman debt was still there, like a ticking bomb. The payments were due. In 1929, Turkey suspended payments because of the global crisis. The old creditors in Paris screamed, "Default!" They tried to pressure their governments to intervene. But this was not the Ottoman Empire. There were no gunboats coming. Ataturk negotiated hard. In 1933, he forced a massive reduction in the debt principal. He made the creditors accept payment in French francs instead of gold pounds, effectively slashing the debt by huge margins as currencies devalued. He was beating the bankers at their own game. The psychology of the nation changed. The peasant, who used to hide his harvest from the tax collector, now proudly brought his goods to the people's houses. The shame of the sick man was replaced by the pride of the self-made nation. Ataturk died in 1938. He left behind a country that was poor, yes, but free. He left a treasury with no foreign debt that was not manageable. He had broken the cycle. But the story does not end at his grave. The final link of the chain was still dragging on the ground. The Ottoman debt, restructured and reduced, still had to be paid. World War II came and went. Turkey, remembering the lessons of the past, managed to stay out of the fire, walking a tightrope between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But the economic pressure was immense. After the war, the world changed again. The vampire bankers of the 19th century were replaced by new institutions: the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Truman Doctrine. The game of debt was becoming more sophisticated. But the Republic of Turkey had a promise to keep. A promise made at Lausanne, a point of honor. They would clear the name of the Turk. They would wash away the stain of the bankruptcy of 1875. Year after year, budget after budget, a portion of the Turkish tax revenue went to pay for the follies of Sultan Abdülmecid and Abdulaziz. Money that could have built hospitals in Van or schools in Trabzon was sent to the heirs of the bondholders in Paris and London. It was a painful reminder. Every time the check was signed, it was a whisper from the past. You are still paying for the palaces. You are still paying for the ironclads that rusted. But the new generation of Turks, raised in Ataturk's republic, viewed this payment differently. It was not a tribute to a master. It was the fee for a clean slate. It was the final exorcism of the empire's ghosts. Finally, the day arrived. May 25th, 1954. The Prime Minister of Turkey, Adnan Menderes, authorized the final transfer. The last installment of the Ottoman public debt. It had been exactly 100 years since the original sin, the first loan of 1854 taken to fight the Crimean War. Think about that. A century. 4 generations. Great-grandfathers had fought the Russians. Grandfathers had fought the Greeks. Fathers had built the factories. And now, the sons finally paid the last penny of the bill. The vampires were finally fed. The account was closed. The file was stamped, paid in full. There were no fireworks. There was no national holiday. It happened quietly, in a bank transfer. But in the history of finance, it was a monumental event. A nation that had been colonized by debt had managed to claw its way back to zero. But history is a circle. As the last Ottoman debt was paid, Turkey was already entering new agreements with the West. New loans, new alliances, NATO, the International Monetary Fund. The golden handcuffs were gone, but the invisible hand of the market was reaching out again. The question remains, did they truly break the chains forever? Or did they just change the metal? The story of the Galata bankers and the 100 years of slavery is not just a history lesson. It is a warning. It is a case study in how a nation loses its freedom, not by invasion, but by transaction. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk understood one thing above all else. There is no political independence without economic independence. He saw that debt is a drug. It feels good when you take it. You can build palaces. You can buy weapons. You can live beyond your means. But the withdrawal is fatal. The Ottoman Empire forgot this. They thought they could outsmart the bankers. They thought they could use European money to fight European powers. They were wrong. The vampires did not care about the Sultan's glory. They cared about the yield. And when the yield was threatened, they repoed the country. Today, looking back at this 100-year struggle, we see the blueprint of modern neocolonialism. The public debt administration does not exist anymore. But we have austerity measures. We have structural adjustment programs. We have sovereign ratings. The mechanisms have changed, but the power dynamic remains. The Galata bankers, Commando, Zarifas, are gone. But their spirit lives on in every predatory loan, in every debt-trap diplomacy project, in every nation that sells its future infrastructure for quick cash today. Ataturk's struggle teaches us that breaking the chains requires more than just bravery. It requires sacrifice. It requires a willingness to be poor but free, rather than rich and enslaved. It requires a leader who tells the people the hard truth, not the sweet lie. The Turkish War of Independence was won with bayonets, but the Turkish Republic was secured by the refusal to sign the check. In the end, who really won the secret war? The vampires got their money. It took 100 years, but they got paid. In the cold logic of capitalism, they won. But they lost the prize they really wanted. They wanted the land. They wanted the soul of the Middle East. They wanted a permanent colony of debt slaves. And that they did not get. One man, and the nation he ignited, stood in the way. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk proved that the will of a people is stronger than the compound interest of a bank. He showed that chains made of gold can be broken by iron and blood. The 100 years of slavery ended not with a whimper, but with a roar. Today, if you visit the Commando stairs in Istanbul, walk up them, admire their beauty. But remember the cost. Remember the farmers who cut down their trees. Remember the women who carried shells in the snow. Remember the price of the ledger. History is full of wars fought for land, for religion, for crowns. But the most vicious wars are the ones fought for the balance sheet. They are the secret wars. And they are still being fought today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the dark heart of Ottoman finance and the fiery birth of a nation. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden mechanics of history, hit that subscribe button. Share this video. Because the only way to avoid the trap is to know it exists. This is History's Secret Wars. And remember, the debt collector never sleeps.